All right. Um, Welcome to the second module. And today I really want to give you some background on the difference between content area and content area reading and literacy to disciplinary literacy. So I'm going to start with a story that I think is kind of illustrative of the ideas that we're going to get, which is that we really want to think of our content areas as kind of social groups. And when I was in my master's program at the University of Michigan, which was much to the chagrin of most of my family that went to Ohio State, but sorry, go Wolverines. While I was there, I remember once I was at a graduate student gathering, and I met somebody who was getting their master's in some kind of big data analytics. And we were talking, and I said to him, I said, that's so intimidating to me. Math is so intimidating because it's so, you've got a right or a wrong answer. And at the time I was an English language arts major. And he laughed and he said, but see, to me, English is so intimidating because you never know when you're right. And I think that kind of was a really interesting for me moment where I realized that oftentimes in different disciplines, we actually kind of converse and view the world differently, and at least use language differently. So when I talked about being sure of being right, and he talked about being sure of being right, I think we were, really kind of talking from different perspectives, different understandings of what it means to quote unquote be right, because he as a mathematician had one kind of understanding and I as an English teacher had a different one. So I thought that that was kind of an interesting thing. And we have to remember when we're secondary teachers or when we're supporting students that are in the secondary schools, we have to remember that our students are often asked to move from these groups every hour, by the hour, right? They have to move from thinking like a mathematician to thinking like a literary critic to thinking like a historian. And they have to do that seamlessly and day in and day out. And I think that's what the beauty of disciplinary literacy is. It kind of gives us some language as the teachers of understanding why that has become such a challenge and maybe doing some better jobs of supporting our students. So for today, I want to give you some of the goals here or some of the background. So I found this, I thought this was interesting. If there's something wrong with society, it probably had its origins in the schools. And if the schools were at fault, it was probably because of the way that the schools taught reading. I thought this was kind of interesting. Here we are in an essay that was written in 1964. And we know, and we have known for a long time, that literacy is at the root of all learning. And so you hear that little trite saying, we're all reading and writing teachers, and in some very significant ways we are. That doesn't mean that we all do the same thing. And I think that's where disciplinary literacy comes into play. So where we're at right now, actually, I wanted to kind of show you some of the quick history of some of the laws that have really kind of challenged us to be better at reading and writing and literacy instruction. And so, we went from 1872, where we had our first standardized curriculum with the first graded course of studies that really relied heavily on what we would call functional literacy, the literacy that our students would need to just kind of get through, sign documents, legal documents, be able to read the newspaper, a lot of recitation. And you'll see we moved through a series of growth and understanding and our needs, like as our society modernized, the needs of what we needed our citizens to be able to do got more complex. So that by 1983, right, we were talking about a nation at risk, and we were talking about this idea that we need people to be able to think more deeply about topics. In 1872, we needed people to be able to read the newspaper, be able to fill out a ballot. But by 1983, we had turned into a modern society that was much more complex in its technical and intellectual needs. So now we have had a plethora of laws that have really created sort of mandates for schools to be able to teach the students, to be able to prepare our students for this complex thinking that we know is often rooted in literacy. And so you probably recognize most of these laws from your schools and a democratic society courses and things like that. But what I wanted to point out to you, though, is that, here we are with all of these laws. We've been trying now for hundreds of years to kind of standardize in a way that meets and addresses these needs. But what we found is that we continue to go flat. I found this graphic because it was such a long period, but actually we have not done better since 2008. And in fact, I believe I showed the Ohio one in our first lecture. So the idea here being that the policy really isn't creating the changes that we wanted. And so we really need to think about what's happening with secondary students. Why are they struggling with language? And so one of the things that we're starting to understand is this idea that we've known that not all reading is the same, but we're really sort of understanding the magnitude and depth to which this statement that was written in 1954, the relevance that it really has. And so what we're going to talk about today is sort of two approaches that evolved in response to our understanding that our students were struggling with reading and writing and basic literacy tasks, particularly in the content areas. So how we evolved from this understanding of content area literacy to disciplinary literacy, which is really going to be the focus of your readings this time. So reading really is not a single process that can be adapted to different contexts. Rather, it is a series of component processes, each of which can be studied in isolation. So what this means is we don't just learn how to read and then we're able to transfer that reading from one context to another context to another context. We actually, when we read, we have to engage in a series of really complex cognitive processes, and we have to be engaging in those processes in ways that are relevant to whatever situation we're reading in. So when I am reading a math or a science textbook, I'm using cognitive processes similarly to what I would use in an English or a history class, but I'm using them in a different series with different emphasis, with different outcomes. And so understanding that as teachers allows us to make more explicit when our students come into our classroom, well, no, I want you to prioritize this because you are in my history class. And when you go across the hall to your English class, you might be emphasizing something different. Okay. And so in a history class, I want you to emphasize thinking about who the speaker was and who their audience was. In my English class, there might be not as much. I want you to emphasize the word choice or the language choices that were used. And if I go into my science classroom, I want you to emphasize the procedures, and I want you to emphasize the process by which they came to their conclusions. See, all of these emphasis, they all require, reading on the sort of most basic level, but the tasks and the purposes for reading really shift as my students move across their schedule, right? So we know, as we talked about, we know that the basic functional skills that a student has, that really there's these pillars, and these came out with the nation at risk, and then in 2000 we had the National Reading Panel, and all of this is to help us to better understand what it is that our students do when they read and why we might be having some problems with their outcomes. And so we know that students, the foundational skills are phonemic awareness, phonics, and fluency. And we know that our students need those things to a certain degree. We also know that a number of our students are going to come into our classrooms that have not mastered these foundational skills. And we're going to have to work with them. We're going to have to work with our intervention specialists. But the idea, or for most of our students, really as content area teachers, disciplinary teachers, we're probably looking at vocabulary and comprehension, because our students are probably engaging with these pillars slightly differently in every class that they go into. And we're actually going to talk quite a bit in this course about the how to help their students to navigate the specialized vocabulary and the specialized focus and purpose that comes so that they can comprehend a text in a disciplinary classroom. So we've kind of evolved. Back in the early 20th century, we called this idea content area reading. And it was this idea that our students needed to be able to read a math textbook. They needed to be able to read a history textbook. They needed to read a social studies textbook. They needed to read a novel, right? But then we moved to this idea of, well, it's not just reading, they also need to write, and they might write differently, like a lab report writes differently than a rhetorical analysis, which might read differently than a personal narrative, right? So we moved it to this idea of content area literacy. Where we're at today, though, is this is an evolution, and all of these were not to say these all added, right? So content area reading, the idea of content area literacy added the idea of reading and writing and listening and speaking and all those other components of literacy. The idea of disciplinary literacy, that really adds to our understanding of content area literacy. So I don't want you to get this idea that we think content area literacy is wrong so much as we think it's incomplete. So content area literacy, which was the kind of approach that we had to addressing reading in the content areas, believed that reading is a cognitive process and that content area teachers overtly teach that process through a series of strategies. So we might teach our students how to summarize or how to visualize. And these are strategies that we would use in your English class. You might be told to visualize. In your math class, you might be told to visualize. In your economics class, you might be told to visualize. So these strategies were kind of like generalized strategies that teachers would get and that they would employ in their disciplinary classrooms. So they were universal, and they were used to build. So we thought that if we could get our students to write a good summary, they would then have access to the content area knowledge, right? They would then understand what they're reading. So disciplinary literacy is a little bit differently. So disciplinary literacy is kind of a way of looking at the world. And really, this is where we get these ideas that our students need to learn to read and write like a historian or like a scientist or like a mathematician, that really these are actual ways of understanding language, that they're somewhat different from discipline to discipline. We start to think of our disciplinary community or our disciplines as kind of communities, right? Discourse communities, where language is shared in a very specific way. And it's important for you to think about how you change the way that you speak when you move from community to community. And so when I used to teach my students this, when I used to talk about that, I would say things like, when you talk to your grandma about going to a concert, right? The way that you talk to your grandma about going to a concert might be different than the way that you talk to your parents about going to that concert, might be different than the way that you talk to your friends about going to that concert, might be different than the way that you talk to, if you're babysitting a younger child, about that concert. And all of that is because our audience and our discourse community is different in each of those situations. And so what we want to think about, if we think about our disciplines as discourse communities, we want to help our students to understand that they might use language in very specific ways because they're in this classroom, they're in a history classroom, or they're in a social studies classroom. And so what we need to do then is we have to think of our students as apprentices. We're inviting them to come in. We're inviting them to think and be and consider the world from the perspective of a historian, or from the perspective of a literary critic, or from the perspective of a mathematician, right? So it's about inviting them in to apprentice, and they're never going to master it, right? Because they are by design, we're giving them a very broad education. And so we really don't want them to master it. We really want to look at it as in terms of, we want them to be able to engage in it. So we do have, right? We do have strategies that we'll use, and we might use them in our disciplinary classrooms. Like we might use a KWL chart, or we might use a reciprocal teaching, or we might use concept-oriented reading. These strategies will work, okay? So those universal strategies, that doesn't mean, so I told you that disciplinary literacy doesn't take away, it doesn't say that content area literacy is wrong. It actually adds to it. But what happens now is, as a teacher, we have to think more carefully about what kind of strategies to use in terms of how do we want our students to use and engage our language. And so we build scaffolds, and my scaffolds might look very different in an English language arts classroom than they look in a history classroom, because the purpose for reading that text, the lens with which we want them to read that text, is very different in those two disciplines. Okay. So what we start to think about then is the old idea of concentrating listener and foreground the thinking processes as a way to, so if we got our students thinking through reading, we could help them to understand our disciplinary work, right? And it flips itself, the disciplinary literacy just flips it on the side. Now, instead, we think about the disciplinary work. We think about the understandings that we want our students to have, and then we help them to engage in cognitive processes. So in a science classroom, a rhetorical analysis where I'm looking at ethos, logos, and pathos, that might not make zero sense, right? They need to look at the procedural. They need to understand, maybe they need to understand the vocabulary, the technical vocabulary. And so it's really different. The kinds of strategies I'm going to pick are going to be very different in a science classroom than in a classroom that maybe is more of a humanitarian take. The problem that we have then is in a lot of our classrooms, we really have very limited access to actual disciplinary tasks. And so one of the things you might think about is, how can I actually give my students, even if it's just practice, they're apprentice, they're not going to master it, but how can I give them some really authentic text from within my discipline? So if I'm a history teacher, that means, what might an authentic text, how can I maybe get them reading primary source documents, the kinds of documents that a historian might read? If I'm in a science classroom, maybe how can I get them to read journal articles, like actual journal articles, right? And so we want to think about, can we bring in authentic text? And maybe we're not bringing in the whole text. Maybe we're exerting and giving people and our students practice with a little bit of those texts. But if we're going to use this disciplinary literacy approach, we're probably going to want to move away from relying on textbooks, because they often are inauthentic, right? They're often incomplete. A language arts textbook might exert part of a play or part of a novel, but we know that authentic literacy, within the discipline, and authentic literacy practice would be to read the entire work, right? And maybe to read multiple works by the same author. And so you want to think about that as you're engaging in your classroom through a disciplinary literacy lens. So we also want to think about the use of writing and how writing is sort of deployed in each of our literacies. So for instance, science writing. Writing is a means for knowledge rather than simply a means of demonstrating knowledge. Scientists write as a way to sort of process, and they welcome, right? They welcome people to challenge theirs, recreate. A writing community in science is very different than a writing community in, say, an English classroom. Okay. We do want to be careful, because activities taken from a community of experts may not automatically be transplanted to a body of novices. So our students aren't going to be able to write a technical journal article, even if we share with them some technical journal articles. They're not going to be able to write a rhetorical analysis, even if we show them a rhetorical analysis. But what we might be able to do is help them to practice that kind of writing. So that's where your lab reports come in. That's where your DBQs come in, things like that. So we find ways to give them practice as apprentices. So when we think about treating students as apprentices, we want to think about what that means. And so in your reading for this week, Guy claims that success in school is primarily contingent on a learner's ability to cope with academic language. And so what we have to think about is, to what extent do we help our students sort of feel welcome as apprentices? Are they able to access sort of the code of our discipline? Do we make explicit our expectations and why those expectations are there? Do we make explicit in a science class why we have to go through Greek and Latin roots, right? And talking about the denseness of the vocabulary in a science in science terminology, right? Do we, when we are in a English classroom, do we explicitly explain why maybe we're going to give you no background? We're going to practice a type of criticism called new criticism, and I'm not going to give you any background on the author, because there's some people that believe that you should only engage with the text itself, and so we're going to practice that today. Do we say these things explicitly to our students so that they understand? And then when they get to your class, when they move from that English classroom to the history classroom, where the history classroom's talking about, think about who the author is, think about who the author is. We don't create this confusion, right? There's not this cognitive disconnect, right? Because our students have been explicitly invited. This is how scientists read this article. This is how a historian would read this piece. This is how a literary critic might read this piece. And in that explicitness, we're kind of showing them the code, if you will, that they can crack. So then, because they are apprentices, we want to think about, what do we do as the teacher? What's our role? So first thing we have to do is we have to find ways to engage, right? I remember I was a proctor for a chemistry test once, and it was really interesting because the kids actually who had pools actually had brought in their like samples from their home pools, and the kids had done these lab reports on it, and a lot of the test was talking about having them analyze what the pool water was telling them about their classmates, and that was engaging for them because they felt like, wow, my classmates might actually be able to use this information that we uncover. So that's like about making your discipline relevant, engaging, motivating them, right? And then you kind of you elicit or you engineer a reason for them to use and read and write and think and talk like your discipline. So you elicit and engineer by creating a problem or a situation where they now need to use your disciplinary literacy lenses. You allow them to examine what they, look at professional, expert examples, prepare their own, keep going back and forth. You're giving them chances to improve, rewrite, redo, and then they get a chance to evaluate. They get a chance to talk about, what did this mean? How is this different? Were you surprised by the way that you had to write as a scientist? Were you, was there anything that felt comfortable or uncomfortable for you? And you give them a chance to kind of really just kind of process it, because they are these novices, and you have to give them a chance to evaluate. All right. So this week, you're going to spend some time looking at these questions of disciplinary literacy. And as always, please make sure that you let me know if you have any questions, okay? So I'll stop sharing and oh,